So please stay to congratulate our winner, and then we'll have a faculty presentation. So I need a drum roll. This is the big award that we give every year. Yes, to the student that achieved the highest GPA. And this year's award, come on again, goes to Tanya Rashisha. So we have a little certificate here, and maybe we could just stand here and get a photograph. Somebody, don't know. Yeah, here. Can you? Thank you. Just one. So thank you. So it also comes with a monetary award. So there is a check coming in the mail for you for $500. And thank you for all the work that you've done. I also want to say that you won a $5,000 award from the Jewish Studies minor. And can you tell us something about where you're going now and how you're using these awards? And let me, you call this. Yeah, so last summer I interned at the SIU synagogue in a town called Hania in Crete. Crete is the largest island in Greece. And I really enjoyed my time there and I really wanted to go back, and the people at the synagogue invited me to come volunteer there again. And one of the things I was worried with was obviously like money, like how I have to support myself in Greece alone. So I applied for an award at the Jewish Studies department, and they were able to give me some financial support. And they give that award to whoever has the highest GPA in the Jewish Studies department. So yes. Can you tell us, or should I say that we're talking about a GPA that is what, 3.99 or 4.0? So that's the highest GPA for English, classics, archaeology, and Jewish studies. So here you Okay. Oh, is this your phone? Oh, yes. Um, and now, Professor Savage is going to come and introduce our keynote speaker. Oh, what's not on? Hold on. Yes. And he can have the slides. I'll turn off here. Yeah, something happened. Okay. Wait, is this in? Jeez. Yes. So if you make this large, yeah, that's a good background. Great. Excellent. Well, how can we get rid of that? Yes. Is it? Is it? Oh, or is it? Yeah. Okay. Oh, is it not? I'll put it out. Oh, yeah, yeah. Hello again, for the third time. So, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ben Marzouk. She graduated from UCLA with a PhD in Levantine archaeology, where she looked at Egypt and the southern Levant and the introduction of metallurgy in both cultural areas. She then had a very prestigious 3 years postdoc funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, where she looked at stances, and probably will hear a little bit about it today. And then she had an also amazing NEH grant to write her book. And part of the research that you are going to hear about today is part of her new book. Um, she's a well-rounded archaeologist. She has excavated in the Near East, in Israel, and also in Syria at Jaffa, Tel Dam, and Tel Hadid. What? Armenia, sorry, but it's a serious. In Tel Hadid, and she is about to go to Jordan this summer and excavate
with Professor Fessler and also Margaret, who is still over there. And so I'm really looking forward to your talk today on the scripts and social networks. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna talk for about 30 minutes. And I don't I had lots of fancy transitions, which might not happen now. Yeah, they're not gonna happen. Okay, so all right. Bear with me. All right. So for those that don't know me, I'm Nadia. My research explores how innovations kind of spread across the East Mediterranean during the Bronze Age. I tend to look at innovation through the lens of craftspeople. So I'm really interested in their knowledge, their skills, and more importantly, their social networks. Today's talk comes out of a larger book project looking at how craftspeople shaped exchange systems in the late third to early second millennium BC. This period wasn't just about moving goods. It also saw the movements of people, ideas, technologies, and ultimately shared practices. In this environment, we start to see the conditions that allowed for the rise of several new writing systems for the first time, most of them linear, some of them pictographic. Traditionally, scholars have explained these new scripts by comparing them to the Egyptian writing system, specifically looking at their graphic connections with Egyptian hieroglyphs. But that approach, I'm going to argue today, often misses a bigger picture, particularly looking at the role of craft networks and interregional connections in shaping writing systems and practices. So, today I want to share some work in progress and explore how early scripts in the East Mediterranean developed as part of a dynamic innovation within these craft networks. Now, before 2000 BCE, the only known scripts in the Mediterranean were Egyptian, both hieroglyphs and hieratic, and cuneiform, largely centered at a palatial site in Ebla, up in Syria. And these two systems were visually very different and materially very different. So cuneiform is wedge shaped, hieroglyphs are pictographic, and then hieratic is semi pictographic. But in the last 15 years, the discovery of clay cylinders at a site called El Mara in Syria, just north of Ebla, bear a linear non cuneiform script. And this has kind of challenged this binary. And we're going to return to this in my second case study. Now, around 2000 BCE, as trade and mobility intensified, something notable happens, and that's after centuries of just a few major writing systems, several new ones appeared. So, in the northern Levant, we get the so called pseudo hieroglyphic script at Byblos that's written on metal and stone. On Crete, we see what's called the Archanes script or formula, and then shortly thereafter, Cretan hieroglyphs on stamp seals and clay labels, followed by Linear A about a century later. In Egypt and Sinai, we see the earliest alphabetic inscriptions show up in mining zones and on tools and objects that are often found as well in the southern Levant, where we also find a pseudo hieroglyphic script on seals. Now, aside from Linear A, most scholarship has focused mainly on Egyptian influence, often limiting analysis to one region or explaining things through broad cultural labels. But an interregional view, however, will show that these scripts emerged from overlapping visual networks that were shaped largely by craft practices. We're going to follow the movement of goods, people, and ideas around the East Mediterranean and look at three case studies that are marked in these red boxes. We're going to look at the Aegean scripts, the Byblos script, and the Levantine pseudo hieroglyphs, and each case study gets shorter and shorter. Before we get into the details of each script, let's pause and ask a very basic but important question, and that's what does it actually take to create a writing system? What kinds of technical and social knowledge go into designing scripts? Now, many inscriptions show up on objects that are made largely by craftspeople. So we can't just look at the signs, we have to think about the act of making them. My approach uses something called a cross craft interaction uh, model, where basically, we need to think about how knowledge and innovation might move between different areas of production and different production systems. If we treat writing as a communicative technology, then we must consider how it intersected with other crafts, like seal carving, metalwork, or textile production. We should ask, why did certain signs catch on? Why were they encountered? By whom and where? To really get at this, we need to move beyond the scripts themselves and look at the makers, the craftspeople, their social lives, and the physical worlds in which they inhabited. To do that, I employ what's called a communities of practice framework. This framework looks at how groups of people sustain engagement around shared domains, like crafting, or making an inscription, and how their practices, symbols, and tools develop over time. It moves us away from vague cultural categories like Egyptian or Aegean and toward an understanding that focuses on the specific purposes that bring people together. In a community of practice, participation matters. That might mean creating shared ideas about how something should be made or used, for example, a script. A big part of this is called situated learning, this idea that knowledge gets passed on through social interaction. Communities often include newcomers and experienced members, and as people cycle in and out of the community, the shared visual language changes and adapts. That's what allows for innovation. So instead of just analyzing signs, we can explore the social worlds of the people who use them. Now, we get glimpses of these communities, these craft communities, through both text and archaeology in the early second millennium. So what do we actually know about craftspeople? At Koltepe Konesh in central Anatolia, and this is going to be like a review for anyone that's taken archaeology classes because we're going all around the Mediterranean now. At Koltepe Konesh in central Anatolia, merchant records mention a man named Puzur Ana, who's a literate metalsmith and a trader, which shows that writing is just not limited to professional scribes. Archaeologically, unfinished seals are found in metal workshops that tell us that seal carving happened alongside other craft activities. Some texts even show that seal carvers acted as legal witnesses, which suggests that they held social authority. At Mari on the Euphrates River, palace records show that skilled workers lived and traveled together, suggesting opportunities to share ideas and visual habits. In Egypt, an inscription by a craft overseer named Irtisen talks about his mastery of materials and his knowledge of hieroglyphs, again, showing how craft knowledge and literacy could overlap. Such examples show how writing was shaped by broader material traditions. And so understanding their origins requires that we think beyond the signs themselves and look at the communities and craft traditions that brought them into being. With this in mind, I want to turn to our first case study, which is the development of writing on Crete. Around the turn of the second millennium, we find what's called the so-called Archanes formula appearing on bone and ivory seals. This is on the left, followed shortly thereafter by Cretan hieroglyphic engraved onto seals but also inscribed into clay. For over a century, debate has centered on whether Egyptian writing influenced the island's scripts, swinging back and forth between external impact and influence and local innovation. Sir Arthur Evans noted striking graphic similarities with the Egyptian scripts already in 1909, some of which you can see here on the left, while imported scarabs to Crete continued to shape this debate as shown in the center. However, a recent study on the right by Silvia Ferrara, Barbara Montecchi, and Miguel Valerio offers a new approach integrating archaeology, paleography, and iconography. They advocate systematically comparing Cretan hieroglyphic signs to their Egyptian counterparts, as well as looking at material culture on the island to assess indigenous origins. One of the case studies that they focus on is the bee. So anyone has taken Dr. Hogan's courses on Egypt or Egyptian hieroglyphs, you know that the bee is part of Egyptian royal titulary. After compiling all Cretan hieroglyphic variants, they show that Cretan bees are inconsistent. So they have fewer legs, they have odd flight angles, they have irregular forms, and just overall they look very wonky. So on the top you can see the Cretan hieroglyphic bee versus the Egyptian bee, and the earliest attestation of the bee on Crete is very wasp-like. So why are they so inaccurate if they're copying this sign? More compellingly, why do they look like wasps and not necessarily the Egyptian bee? However, I wanted to know how this picture would change because I look at stamp seal amulets. So I'm not only looking at the script, I'm also looking at the material culture that is shared and being developed across the Mediterranean. And what we find is, in contemporary contexts in Egypt, we find the same wonky bee signs and even that same tet besh arrangement. Motifs that later become signs in the Cretan hieroglyphic script, as shown on top, appear on Egyptian stamp seal amulets by the late 3rd millennium. For example, we see the famous double axe motif appearing on Cretan seals associated with the Archanes formula. Likewise, depictions of the hand sign resemble cornelian hand amulets with the thumb extended, and also appear in first intermediate period contexts in Egypt. One seal even shows a seated figure with one arm raised and the other lowered, graphically almost identical to Cretan hieroglyphic sign 1. Now, if we compare only the Cretan material with the Egyptian script, we're going to overlook these key parallels. So, what do we actually know about the nature of contact between these communities and at this time? Aegean archaeologist Judith Weingarten has shown that seal producers in Crete were likely in contact directly with Egypt during the late 3rd to early 2nd millennium. And her argument is largely structured. So on top, you have Cretan seals, and on the bottom, you have Egyptian seals, both in contemporary contexts. So Cretan seals start carving animals like lions and monkeys, which are not native to Crete, right? So where are they seeing these things? Um, they also start making seals known as the parading lion group. So in the center, you have lions that tend to circumambulate the diameter of the seal. And this is very similar, as you can see in the center ceiling, to the circumambulation of motifs in seal impressions that were used administratively in Egypt, where we know the lion was a symbol of power. And then we see the importation of scarabs and their local manufacture on Crete. And so she argued that economic ties with Egypt transformed the lion into a Cretan power symbol, while imported Middle Kingdom scarabs inspired local seal production, reflecting shared carving techniques and funerary meanings. Further evidence that seal producers were in direct contact is suggested by the appearance of new motifs in Egypt that are connected to a pre-existing glyptic koine known in the Balkans, Aegean, and Anatolia, dating all the way back to the Neolithic, suggesting a shared visual language was starting to crystallize between Crete and Egypt by the late 3rd millennium. So on the top, you see all these Cretan motifs. On the bottom, all these Egyptian motifs, again in contemporary contexts. Notably, however, we also see the same forms of seals evolve alongside one another. And this is important because these last 3 seal types are the seal types on which we will find the earliest writing on Crete. So not only do they have the same motifs, they have the same seal forms, and then not only are they the same seal forms, it's the seal forms that are then selected to actually have the first writing. Now, many glyptic koine motifs also appear on textile tools like spindle whorls and loom weights, and as patterns on clothing in late Minoan frescoes, suggesting a possible connection to a trans-regional community of practice that's largely rooted in textile production and exchange. Looking at the materiality of the Cretan hieroglyphic script, scholars have proposed that several signs relate to textile production, such as the warped weighted loom, the spider as a symbol of spinning, flax, and even symbols for cloth. This raises the possibility that textile production and exchange played a big role in the script's development. So how might these signs and the seals on which they appear connect to the Egyptian material? For over 3 decades, scholars have suggested that Egypt may have imported Aegean textiles during this period, based on the painted ceilings of nomarchs, so these are like governor type figures, in Middle Egypt, dated to around, say, like 1850 or so BCE. Notably, many of the motifs within these mosaics, such as the C and S scroll, the meander, the labyrinth, the cross and square, and the rosette, also appear on both Aegean and Egyptian stamp seals. Middle Egyptian governors were likely also known to be active participants in an international textile trade, as reflected in these decorative programs. It's interesting then that the same patterns found on Aegean seals, like zigzags and meanders, also appear on the garments of the so-called famed A'amu. This is just people from the east in Egyptian that are found in Beni Hassan, so this very region in Middle Egypt. These are often said to be immigrants coming from the east to Egypt. This is one of the most famed scenes. If you ever take an Egyptian archaeology class, you're going to interact with the A'amu scene. So it's interesting because these textiles have largely been connected with their Levantine identity, but when you actually look at the patterns, they're Aegean textile patterns. So who are these seals buried with? Now, in Egypt, these seals are found mostly with non-royal women and children, and less frequently with men. They cluster in Middle Egypt, the same region as the A'amu depiction and that painted ceiling that I showed. When we pair this with the epigraphic evidence, we actually see that non-royal women and some men held the title Priestess of Hathor, part of a broader effort to expand the royal cult during the Old Kingdom, late Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period, just as this glyptic koine emerges. Meaning this title Priestess of Hathor seems to correlate with the distribution of these stamp seals. So as they move south, you find these titles also moving south. And this is being, I argue, is probably connected to the expansion of the state. Many of the seals also show imagery connected to Hathoric cult. Notably, these titles also cluster at Middle Egyptian administrative sites, tied predominantly to arable land and flax production. So once again, emphasizing this textile connection. Seal iconography has sparked debate, but producers, materials, and cultic ties, I think, speak to this much deeper connection between communities. Now, this connection between textiles, the domain of women and children, and child rearing, and a shared visual language on seals is also reinforced by the spread of the Egyptian hippopotamus goddess Taweret across the East Mediterranean alongside Hathoric imagery. In Egypt, Taweret appears on birth tusks, stamp seals, and other apotropaic objects with a protruding tongue and a knife. Beyond Egypt, she's depicted on a cylinder seal from Byblos, as well as stamp seals from the southern Levant, where this large knife was also found at the site of Tel El Ajul. On Crete, Taweret's arrival during the late Middle Kingdom, so contemporary with the spread of this other imagery, coincides with her transformation into the Minoan genius. And the appearance of a beast with a protruding tongue on stamp seals, as you can see with the red box, also mirrors that of Egyptian forms, which display this kind of angle terminating in the frame line. Why does all this matter for writing? Well, two of the Cretan hieroglyphic signs that appear seem connected to this world, specifically the beast with the protruding tongue and the knife, or this like saw. Yet these are just some of the motifs that are shared. As we see, these also include the double serpent on the left that appears on a Cretan hieroglyphic seal with motifs of Egyptian significance. Next to it is a thread-like motif emphasizing textile connections. And again, at the end, we see this Tetbesh figural composition in connection with a warp-weighted loom and a bee next to a branch-like element that very much recalls Egyptian royal titulary of Nesut Biti, connected to the title of the king. Now, the emergence of writing on Crete was part of a broader trans-regional network linking Egypt, the Levant, and the Aegean through textiles, metals, and semi-precious stones. Cretan seal producers belonged to this mobile network, exchanging motifs and techniques. A shared glyptic koine tied to textiles suggests that these networks were definitely impacted on and shaped early writing. Hathoric and Taweret imagery suggests links between seals to fertility, kind of highlighting women's overlooked roles in this process. Writing was not just symbolic, it was a material technology that was very much shaped by social networks and shared craft practices as we see these communities coming into increasing contact with one another. With this in mind, I want to turn to our next case study. And in the second case study, I want to think about how graphic connections between Byblos, this is a coastal site up in the central Levant, in modern-day Lebanon, how graphic connections between what's known as the Byblos script and the Aegean scripts that we just looked at complicate our understanding of script innovation. Now, the so-called Byblos script is an undeciphered writing system, and I should also say the Aegean scripts are also undeciphered as well. Byblos script is an undeciphered writing system written in about 100 to 114 pseudo-hieroglyphic signs, known only from 14 inscriptions, all of which lack clear stratigraphic context, dug predominantly from the site of Byblos. Attempts to date the script's development therefore rely on paleographic parallels with the Egyptian hieroglyphs and hieratic script, which have led most scholars to accept an early 2nd millennium dating, while some recognize that some forms are most similar to the late 3rd millennium signs. So there's debate on when this dates to. People just look at the different sign forms and they say, oh, this looks like the Old Kingdom sign of this glyph that we know. Well, this one looks like a Middle Kingdom sign. So most people would date it between the late 3rd to early 2nd millennium. Paleographically, as you can see, just to give you an idea, the rows marked with B on the top mean Byblos sign, and those marked with E suggest parallels in the Egyptian scripts, which reflect a mix of both hieratic and hieroglyphs. Now, graphic similarity between the Byblos script and the early alphabet on the very bottom has also been proposed by various people over the years, raising questions about the timeline of the development and the nature of interaction. Some scholars have also suggested links between the Byblos script and Cretan hieroglyphs or Linear A, based on graphic comparanda. And while some are compelling, such as the ones that are highlighted, the rest, I would say, are pretty questionable. But because no inscriptions have been found outside of Byblos, advancing our understanding of the script remains very challenging. That is, I would argue, until the discovery of 4 clay cylinders from an elite tomb at Al Mara, located in northern Syria, dated to about the 24th century BCE. Now, these were initially published in 2010 as just a non-cuneiform script, but they've since gained attention given their recent possible classification as the earliest alphabetic writing. So, this would push back the alphabet's invention by 500 years. And these are weird in their location. We have nothing between these cylinders and the other earliest alphabetic writing in Sinai. So this is the czar. Now, this interpretation is based as alphabetic is based largely on graphic similarities to alphabetic signs in the early second millennium, and in some cases, signs dating as late as the first millennium. So there's a lot that needs to be explained. There were 2 signs, and I don't think it's not gonna disappear. But behind this, there's 2 signs that are highlighted, and it's these 2 signs that the excavator noticed look very similar to Egyptian writing. However, I've recently reevaluated these. I have a paper under review right now, which hopefully will be accepted soon. And I want to share some of my results with you. Rather than classifying these, when I was looking at these, I thought these look very Egyptian to me, but there were certain elements of these cylinders that didn't look Egyptian. And so I started to play around with it a little bit. And actually, rather than classify these only as Egyptian, I think they provide the first documented evidence of biblioscript innovation. So this is the first time that we actually have evidence coming from a solid stratigraphic context that speaks to biblioscript innovation, which I'm going to argue emerged within a multilingual, ethnically mixed transregional expedition community that engaged in the exchange of, once again, textiles and liquid commodities, among other things. So first, you can see the signs share paleographic parallels with various Egyptian hieroglyphic and hieratic forms. And for those that have never taken hieroglyphs before, or Egyptian, hieratic is just the ink-based script. So it's like taking hieroglyphs and it's writing it on papyrus in ink. So think of it as like a cursive script. Basically reinforcing this connection to Egyptian scribal traditions of the late 3rd millennium. However, one graph lacks Egyptian parallels, which is a point to which I will return shortly, and that's the one here. You can see it double here. This one we can't find in the Egyptian scripts. Now, in addition, I propose that we can actually read cylinder 3B as an Egyptian textile label, reading left to right as Shesher Menhet Su 14, which means Shesher linen, 1 cubit wide, day 14. Key here is the combination of a right-facing hieratic arrow and the hieroglyphics Menhet sign, as we see this combo on linen lists from Giza. Additionally, hundreds of clay labels from the Menkaure Valley Temple reflect a cursive script as shown on the far left. And of interest here is this ceiling, which documents royal Itiyu linen, which can be read left to right, providing a contemporary parallel for the Al Mara cylinder. So what was an Egyptian textile label doing in Syria, and how does it connect with the development of the biblioscript? It was recently suggested that the toponyms Dugaratsu and Dulu mentioned in the archives from the Palace of Ebla, and this is a massive palace site from about 2400, 2300 BCE, with thousands of cuneiform documents that were preserved. So it gives us a lot of insight into what was going on in the region. These 2 toponyms that were named have recently been reconstructed as Egypt and Byblos, respectively. So the archives document shipments of known Egyptian goods that include linen from Dubaratsu to Ebla, while Ebla sent lapis, silver, and tin in return, paralleling commodities mentioned in 6th dynasty stela from well-known Egyptian expedition leaders like this guy named Ini. Notably, the Ebla texts describe what is referred to as Kirnanu linen, sent exclusively from Dugaratsu and Dulu, so exclusively from Byblos and Egypt. And their men often acted as emissaries for Dugaratsu. Kirnanu linen is documented in a range of sizes in the Hubla archives, including narrow and short, and was argued to be possibly connected to burial shrouds. So the mention of Cheshire linen, 1 cubit wide, on the Mara cylinder in a funerary context raises the possibility of new evidence to document the linen exchange between Egypt and Ebla. Yet our inability to read cylinders A and C suggests script modification was also occurring, as signs with parallels in Egyptian hieratic appear alongside a unique sign only resembling sign A14 in the Byblos script, which matches not only the form but also the stance that is found in other Byblos script inscriptions, aligning it largely with, in terms of reading direction, hieratic conventions, so suggesting a similar orientation. Now, another overlooked data set to support Byblos script formation is the context of Levantine Egyptian exchange, is combed ware vessels. So on the right, this was connected to the liquid commodities exchange, and you have these coming from the Levant being sent down to Egypt and showing up in Egyptian elite tombs. Why these are important is these vessels are linked petrographically to the region around Byblos and highlight the importance of liquid commodity exchange with Egypt during the Old Kingdom. But what's interesting is 10% of the Byblos script signs find exact parallels on the pot marks that are used for comb ware vessels. So it thus appears that the formation of the Byblos script modified the Egyptian writing system by incorporating new signs of local and regional significance, many of which appear on combed ware vessels, which reinforces this link between commodity exchange and early writing innovation. Now, the Ebla archives document cross-linguistic and cross-regional interactions in expedition contexts, complicating our understanding of these communities. So, emissaries from Dugaratsu or Egypt frequently traveled with men from a region known as Kakmium, which is probably somewhere in Syria, and Ebla's second largest economic partner after Mari. Now, Kakmium merchants carried out expeditions to Egypt. They'd stop at Dulu or Byblos with individuals traveling between these regions, mirroring Inni's 4 expeditions to the Levant. So that expedition leader from Egypt, it matches perfectly with expeditions and places that he's known to stop, meaning that people from different linguistic backgrounds and different regional backgrounds were part of the same community. These people literally traveled together. Regardless of how we identify Dugaratsu or Dulu, because there's still some debate of if this is really Egypt or Byblos, the evidence suggests that a trans-regional community engaged in the movement of goods and people and provides the social locus around which the Byblos script probably developed. And indeed, the Mara cylinders and Byblos script share several text production practices with Egyptian scribal tradition. So it's not just how the script looks, it's how they're actually writing their inscriptions. Marking a transitional phase where Egyptian writing was adopted, new signs were introduced, and script formation was driven by material and social exchanges. So these include bidirectionality, meaning you could write left to right or right to left. They often wrote in a cursive script, and they even used an Egyptian style of date. Such shared features point to a trans-regional community of practice that involved Egyptian scribes, Levantine merchants, here we go, Levantine merchants, and local elites. However, both the Mara cylinders and Byblos script also diverge from Egyptian writing in the same way, suggesting that there's some connection between these two data sets. So these contrasts include the incorporation of new signs and stancing the signs in a way that often will deviate from Egyptian conventions. So either facing away from the start of an inscription, because in Egyptian you would want them to face toward the start of the inscription. This suggests that the Byblos script's development was not a single moment of invention, but probably an evolving process over centuries within a trans-regional network. Anchoring the script's innovation in the late 3rd millennium has broader implications, though, especially when we zoom back to our first case study in the Aegean. I know I'm giving everyone whiplash here, but we can talk more about it in Q&A. As we see striking graphic parallels between Cretan hieroglyphs, these are the ones shown, so we go Cretan hieroglyphs, linear A, and Byblos. So you can just kind of run your eye across and you can see striking similarity now between these 3 scripts. So whereas in the past everyone was looking solely to Egypt, I think we've completely missed the potential interplay between the Byblos script and the Aegean scripts. At most in the past, maybe 10 signs were identified, and here we have over 30. Furthermore, the signs, the linear A signs, so this is the script that comes after Cretan hieroglyphs, the fraction signs that are used, 75% of the linear A fraction signs are found when we rotate them in the Byblos script, suggesting some sort of connection, especially if we start to consider things like numerical accounting and commodity exchange. Now, such similarity suggests a shared script genealogy that's perhaps been overlooked, with innovation occurring through adaptation within mixed literate trans-regional exchange communities. Returning to the pot marks of the late 3rd millennium vessels from the central Levant, we find similarities with various script signs, not just Byblos scripts. So, for example, up here you have Cretan hieroglyph 65, which is very similar to this applied pot mark. You have the linear notation for 100 that appears as a pot mark, and so on. Some of these signs actually, which will take us to our next case study, are pseudo-hieroglyphic signs that you find on seals from the southern Levant. Now, this suggests that alongside Egyptian influences, connections between Byblos and the Aegean also played a role in script development. And I'm not really interested in which directionality that took. It's the point here is that there was contact, and that contact was probably mutually beneficial in terms of impacting local practices. Now, these findings bring us to our final case study, and it's very, very short. This is on pseudo-hieroglyphic scarabs from the southern Levant. Now, scarabs started appearing in the southern Levant around the same time as early writing systems were emerging around the East Mediterranean. Previous scholarship has found that early local designs were influenced by Egyptian scarabs. So, for example, the local Canaanite, it's not on here, but local Canaanite seals look almost virtually identical to their Egyptian counterparts with slight innovations. Daphne Bentor is the person who has largely studied these, and she looked at them and she said, well, these look like Egyptian glyphs, but they don't make any sense in Egyptian, so these must be pseudo-hieroglyphs. In fact, some of these signs don't even appear in the Egyptian scripts. Therefore, they're pseudo-hieroglyphics. They're just imitating Egyptian, and they're just writing pretend writing. This has been the standard, but as I've been working on these for the past 4 years, and I was thinking, I noticed the same sign sequences sometimes appear. And I was thinking as I was working on the Byblos script, interesting, you actually see some of these signs in the Byblos script. So I think we need to rethink kind of the standard and ask, have we overlooked this data set? So the next few slides follow the same format. So on the right, you're going to have a Middle Bronze Age scarab from a well-excavated early 2nd millennium context. Then in the center, you will have the graphic parallel to signs in the Byblos script, and then in the left, signs that might be coming from the Egyptian scripts. As you can see, graphically very similar, and you actually have that angle sign that we saw on the Aegean and Egyptian scripts, kind of with the guy with the protruding tongue. So there's definitely some sort of graphic connection here that's shared across craft communities. Here you can see a seal from Megiddo that very much looks like an actual inscription in an unknown script. You can see the graphic parallels between the Byblos script and the Southern Levantine one. Here again, just to highlight, this sign here is only found in the Byblos script. No other known scripts. So something else is going on here. There's various seals, but I summarize the graphic parallels here. Yet, these connections go beyond individual signs as they extend to how the seals themselves were designed. So the arrangement of signs in vertical columns with double-line dividers appear on both Byblos script stela and Middle Bronze Age scarabs from the southern Levant. Some Byblos stela also outline their signs the same way that we see on Middle Bronze Age scarabs. Signs that don't exist in the Egyptian scripts appear on both Byblos and Middle Bronze Age scarabs, as well as hieratic signs suggesting some sort of shared practice. And hieratic on seals doesn't make any sense because hieratic is largely cursive. You want the materiality of the writing is such that it's typically ink-based. So this raises an important question. Have we overlooked this corpus in dating the development of the Biblos script? And this is something that I'm currently studying right now. So just some concluding thoughts. When we pull together the different regional threads, we weave a much more complicated picture than currently exists, one that raises new questions about the nature of contact between communities and the graphic worlds in which they inhabited and shared. As I've shown, these scripts appear to develop alongside a trans-regional trade in textiles. I didn't talk about it too much, but metal and semi-precious stones, as well as liquid commodities and um, other various goods, as well as alongside the sharing of motifs and the development of a glyptic koine. We can also map the movement of craftspeople as well as shared practices of body adornment and potential amuletic practice, and ask how, through cooperation, shared repertoires were renegotiated as these scripts developed. Craftspeople were active agents in these networks and may have included women and children, highlighting the family as a possible locus of innovation. Ultimately, this research reframes script development as a process embedded in craft networks, highlighting artisans, trade, and shared visual repertoires as key drivers. We still need more work to explore the nature of graphic similarity across scripts and other craft traditions, but I hope to have convinced you in part that this approach moves us beyond isolated cultural models and towards a more interconnected view of early writing in the East Mediterranean. Thank you.
Wait, question? Did any question?
Yeah, Mark.
You mentioned where the when your spindle rolls have decoration. I was just curious about that because I know what I looked at the spindle rolls from side of the soul. It was like no decoration at all.
Yeah, so um, for Korean hieroglyphic, there is a shared craft koine on textile tools. So a lot of the seals that we find that have this glyptic koine motif, you can actually see them stamped into loom weights and actually drawn or sometimes incised into the whorls, as you see here. So sometimes they're stamped into whorls, sometimes they're actually incised, and you typically, and this is not just with Crete. This is in the Cyclades. This is Western Anatolia. This is, but largely coming out of kind of an Aegean world. So I think that's what's really important. You tend not to find these, for example, in, I can't think of a single spindle world that I know of in Egypt during this period, but you don't find these in the Levant necessarily. So the decorative program is very much coming out of like textile tools in the Aegean world.
I had a question about the dying seal, which I think is like the slight before or after this, because it's a
Which one?
it's like it's the one.
Yes, yeah.
That's a Murex.
Yes, it's a Murex shell.
Do you find that in Biblos as well? Because I feel like or something like it with spikes. I don't know, like a line with spikes. I'm just wondering because
In the script?
yeah, I'm wondering.
Not that I've found. No.
It seems like there would be a connection there.
Yeah. Not in the sign form that I found, but I'm still going through it. We also only have 14 inscriptions. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about is like, we have hundreds of seals that are called pseudo-hieroglyphic in the Southern Levant that have just been written off. And so I'm actually doing a systematic analysis right now, mapping all of the sign forms and looking for kind of co-occurrences of certain signs to see, is this actually real writing? And if it opens up a new corpus to potentially start talking about, are we looking at the Biblos script? So it might be that. So Heidi's talking about this sign, and this is connected with textile dyeing, specifically the color purple. So this was a Murex shells were used to make the color purple. It was a highly technical process, and the color purple became an elite color because the process itself was so labor intensive that it was largely restricted to elites. Yeah, good question. That was one of my first questions. I was like, oh, do we have this at Biblos? And I couldn't find it in the Biblos script. But
Yeah, because Biblos also is a place that was known for textile dyeing, especially with the Murex. Yeah.
Cool. Just because to know if you taking track conscious, because I think it would actually occur on the text from Murray in
oh, about the guys from Ugarit?
no, the guy from Crete.
You know, the Cretans are coming through but they're coming from Ugarit.
And that's the translator that comes with them. So I
Yeah.
think it could also add the
yeah.
the knowledge about all of these languages that were shared between these merchants in this
Yeah, definitely. Oh yeah, I have that text. Um, any other questions?
Can you take us back to the conclusions just to get it again?
If I follow. Not all this was awesome, but I feel like I'm learned a ton and I'm inspired. And then I have these weird philosopher questions that have to do with like so. I mean, there's a really interesting sort of thematic about potentially feminist interpretations of the way these things are emerging in their trajectory. But let me ask a slightly different one. Maybe I'll just follow up on that one if that's all. But uh, so is it some part the total story here that the emergence of scripts is essentially economically tied? Like that's really coming out. There's lots of reasons why you might have thought scripts would have developed, given how scripts were for us and how important they are to us. Is the deep thesis really this comes because people have to engage in trade or they have to keep track of things,
Yeah.
or it's not playing any like expressive role in like funerary, political, religious.
So yeah, good question. And yes, absolutely. What I think we're looking at right now, I didn't really get into it, but I have a couple of my students from my art and archaeology of the Aegean world here, and we talked about this. Is that on Crete during this period, some of these monkeys are probably coming from the Indus Valley and actually being imported to the island. So I think we're looking at what I would kind of frame as early globalization, early globalized networks. And a lot of these seals, when they appear, many of them are known from impressions, meaning an administrative practice of documenting something. And so, very early on, by the early second millennium, this is coming after a period of climactic shift where you have people moving around the Mediterranean. There's this massive period of aridification, and you start to get the emergence of new palatial elites. And so, as part of this kind of shared koine, shared visual language, I'm looking at like how graphic design is impacted by globalization and how, and I'm kind of playing around with models like this, thinking about how this impacted on shared economic practices. And I think one of the things when you're talking about craftspeople is we tend to, one of the first things we're taught is like, oh, craftspeople serve the elites. And our own relationship with technology and labor is very much coloring, I think, how we should understand skilled knowledge and labor in the past. And these people were, I mean, we have texts talking about metalsmiths who were also merchants, who were also seal carvers, who had different literacies, who were also teaching their own form of writing in their home. And so, just as we all have different skill sets, I think one of the things I'm trying to do is to re embed these skill sets back into these discussions so we don't have something like the mobile craftsman just wandering aimlessly around these Mediterranean.
Yeah, I got it's meals. Yes, I mean, it makes me think of like the practicality and the functionality of early writing. I mean, our earliest writing is just receipts, but then the artistry of the scribe that's trying to recreate that idea on a tablet or on stone. Because people are telling stories, but like oral, they can't read anyway, so they rather just do oral tradition. But then, so the art is within those crafts people. It's just different.
And what's interesting too, to go to the funerary sphere, is you find a lot of these in twos. So whether that was you get buried with your administrative title or you're passed on with your family seal, a lot of them are amuletic though. And so I think there's this interplay between and kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? I'm blanking on the word, but there's an interplay and multivalency in terms of how they're being used. And so you find the same amuletic signs, things that have kind of ritual significance, also being incorporated into the scripts.
So I like your second point. That's why I wanted to see the end. So essentially, you make these craftsmen as agents where they are creating a script that works within the family.
Yeah.
So they're innovators there. And then with this script where they keep track of their exchange, then they
Yeah.
and actually export it
and that's the expedition community. They take it with them.
Yeah.
Right.
And also, I think one thing too, with this family as a locus of innovation, many of us come from blended families. Many of us grew up speaking different languages in the home. And when it comes to craft practice in the ancient world, it was imperative that you passed on your craft to your son or daughter. So much so that there's actually adoption laws where if you're if you don't have a son or daughter, you can adopt one, and then if they don't get it, you can sever that tie and adopt a new one. And so I think there's also texts that talk about, you know, in Anatolia, for example, great texts that talk about men from offshore who have wives back home, and they're writing letters to their wives back home, and they take new wives in central Anatolia as part of their business transactions, and you really have these blended families. And I think this is one of the ways that craft practice also becomes innovated within the family as kind of this locus of production.
So do you have like workshops of scribes?
So in central Anatolia, you actually have metal. There's a ton of metalworking workshops, and in one of those workshops, you actually have archives that seem to be scribal texts. So this speaks to probably scribal training within the home. We don't have seal workshops. One exception is so one of the ways that we make workshops is based on stylistic features, the grouping of stylistic features.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.